So today we will be beginning our biology strand of the grade 10 science, and so I'm going to introduce you to cells. Now, some of you may have studied cells in elementary school, and this will be a refresher, and others of you, this may be entirely new. So let's get to it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is cell theory. And what a theory is an idea or a set of principles that are generally accepted by the scientific community in order to sort of explain what we observe. So there are a few tenets of that, and so let's get through them. So the first one is that all living things are made up of one or more cells. And I think that makes sense, right? But what you may not know is that some living organisms are only comprised of a single cell, right? So this right here, for example, is what we call a paramecium. And if you're signed up for grade 11 biology, you will be learning a lot more about the paramecium. But it is a single-celled organism. So single-celled organisms have a name. We call them, a unicellular organism. Okay, uni meaning one. Okay, so, it follows that, right? It's made up of one cell. However, most organisms are made up of more than one cell. And here I have the example of a tomato plant under a microscope. Here we can see one cell, two cells, three cells. Those organisms we call multicellular. Okay, they have multiple cells in them. So you and I, as animals, are multicellular by definition. Okay, so let's look at the second tenet. So number 2, the cell is the simplest unit that can carry out all life processes, and that is key here. So some people will ask the question, well, is a virus living? And so a virus is not considered to be living because it doesn't have all the machinery to kind of reproduce on its own, so it cannot carry out all life processes. So here's an example of a virus, and again, if you're taking grade 11 biology, you will see this in more detail. So this is strictly an example, is that, here is a virus, and a virus does have its own, nuclear material like DNA or RNA, but it can't reproduce on its own. It needs to invade what we call a host cell and use the host's machinery to reproduce. So for that reason, viruses are not considered to be living. And so, when we talk about cells being the simplest unit of life that can carry out all life processes, then, we have to look at whether that cell can reproduce. Okay, next. So the last part of cell theory, I think, will make sense to you. All cells come from pre-existing cells, right? So, the first cell presumably is a bit of a more complex story, but from then on, every cell that we have is going to have come from a pre-existing cell. And in fact, a little bit later on in this unit, we're going to be learning about how cells divide. So, imagine that we have this mother cell, and it's a mother cell because it's going to produce some other cells. It's going to replicate. So we can see here in the cell, we have these blue and green strands. Those are representing, the DNA, the genetic material inside of that cell. And so if that cell is going to divide and become 2 new cells, then we know it's going to have twice as much DNA as it had previously, right? And so let me just go back for a second here. So here we can see that DNA has replicated, right? Again, these are details we're going to go into in another lesson, but just to give you an idea about how this works, a sneak peek, as it were, so that cell is going to eventually become 2 cells, each with its own set of DNA. So the mother cell becomes 2 daughter cells. And so every daughter cell that results was once a mother cell. So all cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay, so now I want to talk to you also about another way that we classify organisms. So we looked at unicellular and multicellular organisms. But we can also classify organisms based on whether they have a couple of different, we can classify cells based on whether or not they have a couple of structures. One of them is whether or not they have this thing called a nucleus, and whether or not they have these things called organelles. And you might be like, what's an organelle? Well, in elementary school, I know some of you have discussed this, but just to make sure everybody is on the same sort of playing field for this, an organelle is a specialized part within a cell that has a certain function or a job to do. So you can sort of think of it like, in our school building, we have multiple people, but each of those people, each of those individuals in the school has a different function within the building. So for example, teachers are obviously going to be leading classroom. We have our EAs that are helping to assist students, and we have our custodians who are happy to keep our place nice and clean and sanitized, and of course we have our principal and vice principal. So each of those individuals have a different job to do. Well, in the same way, a cell that has organelles, each of those organelles has a different job to do in that cell. So we're going to look at a couple of different cells, and you're going to tell me which of them you think has organelles and which does not have organelles. So here's this cell right here, and here's a different cell. Well, I'm hoping you can see that the cell that is on the right has, has a bunch of different complex structures. It definitely looks like it's more involved. And if you picked the cell on the right, then you're correct. What we have on the left here is what we call a prokaryotic cell, and it's a lot simpler. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And what we have on the right here is a eukaryotic cell, which is a little bit more complex. Okay, so prokaryotic cells are what we see in, if your organism is a unicellular organism, then it is, chances are likely to be prokaryotic. So we only find prokaryotic cells in organisms that are single-celled. And what makes them, and it makes sense because if you're only made up of one cell, chances are you're not super complicated. Those cells are not going to contain a nucleus, and they're not going to contain a bunch of membrane-bound organelles. So let's take a look at an example, and a good example of that is a bacterial cell. So for instance, if you have some sort of bacterial infection, you're going to have potentially a bunch of this type of cell in your body. So let's just look at the structure generally speaking, and you should have a diagram of this in the notes for you to take a look at. So, this cell has definitely a cell, some of them have cell wall, cell membrane, but more importantly, what I want you to notice is that inside the cell, there's not very complicated. It has this, a region that is like a nucleus, but notice it's not membrane bound, right? We have these little ribosomes, but we don't have a bunch of membrane bound organelles in here, okay? And so prokaryotic means no nucleus, okay? It has a nuclear region, but not a defined membrane bound nucleus. And it does not have a bunch of complicated organelles. So this is a topic you will explore in great detail in grade 11 biology. So here's just under a micrograph, and you can tell that this is a prokaryotic cell. Here's our nucleosome region, our nucleoid region. Here we have the rest of the cell, but there's no defined sort of organelles going on in here. Okay, and so the type of cell we're going to be spending a lot more time on is the eukaryotic cell. And so if you have a more complex organism, chances are its cells are going to be eukaryotic in nature, and we're going to see a bunch of membrane-bound organelles, and the nucleus will be bound in a membrane as well, right? So some examples, well, we have plant cells, animal cells, and fungi cells. And so this is a bit of a sneak preview to grade 11 as well, because we're going to be talking about all of these different kingdoms. So take a minute to just look at each of these diagrams and see, well, what is the same and what is different? Now, what I'm hoping you're seeing is that plants have a bit of a thicker outer wall here, and so does the fungus, but it's a slightly different wall, whereas the animal cell doesn't really seem to have that. I'm hoping you're seeing that, the plant cell has this great big sort of, water storage area, whereas the animal cell doesn't. Right? But they have a lot of different structures that are the same, that they have in common. They all have this nucleus represented by a purple sort of area. Okay, the fungus you're going to see sort of pinching off here, and so you might have seen that in a previous video where we talked about the hydra. So now, what we're going to be learning about this year are animal and plant cells, and fungi will come up next year if you're taking grade 11 biology. Okay, so let's sum things up. So if we choose to divide cells or classify cells in this way, we can talk about all cells and all living organisms, and we can break them down into unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. And so, of course, our unicellular organisms are organisms made up of a single cell, whereas multicellular organisms are made up of more than one cell. Right? So if you are unicellular, you can either have cells without a nucleus, making you a prokaryotic organism, or you can be made up of one cell, but that one cell does have a nucleus, in which case you are a eukaryote, a eukaryotic organism. However, by definition, if you are multicellular, then you must have cells that are eukaryotic. You must have cells that contain both a nucleus and organelles. Okay, so I hope that summed it up nicely for you. You're going to be learning a little bit more in the next section about plant and animal cells and the details of that. For some of you, this will be review. If it's not and you're struggling and you need some assistance, absolutely reach out via Zoom and I'll be happy to help clarify or give you a little bit more practice.